Hello and welcome to a new review. Today we're going to take a look at the Abhyss archetype, which is the new reptile archetype coming out in Ancient Guardians, which for us, the TCG, coming around I think the start of May after the delay. One thing that we're going to do in this video is basically explain the cards, explain what they do, basically kind of like also go down the route of like, what they're all about, and essentially also giving you a little bit more tips at the end and what my thought process overall at the end. So if you are new to these type of videos, this is pretty much what we're doing here. But before we jump right into the review itself, I'm going to remind you the usual thing that a subscriber a day keep the depression away. So if you want to help the channel, see this channel grow, see more videos like this, I would really appreciate if you can hit that subscribe button, because it's really means a lot to me and it's give me energy to want to create more videos. And if you can share these videos around with people that will also be interested in this, please do. But without further ado, let's jump right into the review itself. Alright, so for the archetype itself, basically this is an archetype of light and dark reptiles, and except from the boss monster, which is the last monster that we're going to talk about, basically all of them are going to work in pairs of the light and dark. They kind of like have the same kind of like summoning requirement, or effect in the graveyard, or a particular effect specifically that they do. They share a specific similar effect, the pairs, but they have their own individual effects as well. So do keep that in mind, that I'm going to show them in the pairs that they are, because it's also in the serial order as well. So, some of the monsters do share the same effect. But let's jump right into them. So we're going to start things off with Null, Dreg of the Abhyss, and this one basically says that you can send him from your hand to the graveyard and send a dark reptile, any reptile, not even archetype related, from your deck to the graveyard as well. And then if you control no monsters, or if you control an Abhyss monster, you get to special summon him from the graveyard, but banished wouldn't leave the field. On top of that, if you have him on the field, and he's special summoned by this effect, like, while he's face up in the monster zone, you cannot summon any monsters except from reptiles, which is not the end of the world, because you can always just like make a link to with this or something, because you're most of the time going to have another monster, so it's not the end of the world. But yeah, this is pretty much what he does. I'm going to give this one 4 stars for a few reasons. First and foremost, he's allowing you to discard himself to set another card in the graveyard. Secondly, he's kind of like a Cyber Dragon-ish card, but from the graveyard, or should I say like a Photon Thrasher from the graveyard, but also can be special summoned if you control a monster from the archetype, if you control other monsters, but it doesn't limit you if you control control only monster from the said archetype. So this is really cool for swarming. Very good card. And on top of that, yeah, sure, it does lock you into reptiles, but getting 2 level 4s to your side of the field is not that hard, and you can get King of the Feral Imps with this and just leave him in the graveyard, which is pretty cool. So this card is great. I like him quite a bit. Then for his pair, which is his dark version, Nihil, Dreg of the Abhyss. This one, you get to, basically does the same thing, but instead of sending a dark, you send a light reptile from your deck to the graveyard, if you send him from your hand to the graveyard. And then on normal or special summon, which is his own effect, you get to add 1 Abhyss spell or trap from your deck to your hand. But you can only use this effect, of course, once per turn. Now, I'm going to say this. This one might sound a little bit stupid for some people, to send him from your hand to the graveyard, because, you don't get the search effect, but there is a particular monster, which kind of like 2 monsters, which we'll get to them, and then when we'll get to the final monster of these chain, I will explain that. But the point is, you get the ability to get this effect even if you send him to the graveyard. You'll see what I mean when we'll get to it. But I'm going to give this one 5 stars right now. He's a searcher. He basically fill your graveyard as well with some particular cards that you want. And mostly, apparently, the lights are better than the dark, which you'll see what I mean. But for the most part, this card is great. And I like him, again, quite a bit because of this particular thing. And he's just able to just fill your graveyard, again. Really important. And search your spells and traps. Really nice as well. Then we have one of the bad cards first. And that is, Phlogi, I believe how you pronounce this. Phlogi, Haze of the Abhyss. And this one, if it's sent from your field to the graveyard, you get to special summon, or special summon from the graveyard, sorry, you get to activate the following effect, which is targeting 1 face-up monster your opponent control and 1 face monster in the graveyard with attack equal or higher than the current monster on the field. Special summon the targeted monster from the graveyard, and then send the card that you targeted to the graveyard, which is pretty bad. I'm going to give this one 2 stars. However, the only reason why I'm giving this 2 stars and not 1 star, because this effect would 100% be horrendous otherwise, is that you don't have to activate this effect. It's not mandatory. It says you can. But its other secondary effect, which also shared with his pair, is actually okay, and that's the reason why you might still want to run 1 copy of it. Because this one allowing you to basically send 1 card from your hand to the graveyard and then retrieve him back to your hand. Like I said, his effect in the graveyard is shitty. But the fact that you're able to retrieve a card back is actually really crucial and have some particular application in the archetype, because you're able to unclog your big monsters, which is really cool. Or any other card that you want specifically. So I like this quite a bit, that effect, but I definitely think this card is bad. Then we're going to move on into the better part of the pair, Zoha Haze of the Abhyss, and I'm going to give this one 4 stars immediately, because this card is absolutely awesome. This one is when it's sent from the field to the graveyard, same effect, or special summon from the graveyard, same effect as that. He's able to, unlike his other light counterpart, he's able to make your opponent draw a card, and then if they do, you're able to add Abhyss card or Abhyss monster from your deck to your hand, and then you're able to, do a Dark World dealing effect. So basically, you add any monster except himself, and then you send each player send 1 card from their hand to the graveyard, which is great. And then he has the same grave effect of, the previous one, to basically send them a card from the hand to the graveyard and then retrieve into your hand, which is, again, great. And the reason why I'm saying this card is great, why do I say this card is great? Is because of the fact that this is kind of like a Dark World dealing / Mothman effect, but unlike those two, it's a little bit less, minus, because if you're able to, tribute this card or, get it, link it off to something or do something with it, you don't lose any advantage, and you're still being able to get a targeted search and then send, if you want that targeted search, to the graveyard or any other card from your hand. So it's able to kind of fix your hand. It's able to force your opponent sometimes drawing their bricks or sending cards that they don't want from the graveyard. Sure, it could fix their hand. That's the problem with it, but it's not the worst thing in the world. It's kind of like and you do need to understand that Dark World Dealings and Mothmans are cards that have been played in the meta. So this effect is not terrible, and sending it to the graveyard is not that bad. Now, the problem is that right now in this format, we do have Ghost Bell and Haunted Mansion and Skullmeisner, but I'm pretty sure they're going to be toned down maybe next format once we're going to get Ancient Guardians. We'll have to wait and see, but this archetype definitely going to suffer if they don't have, if Ghost Bell and Haunted Mansion and Skullmeisner will not be toned down. So I'm just going to say that out there. But otherwise, this card is pretty great. Not as good as your Searcher for Spells and Traps, but still pretty good. Then we move on into the first pair of tributes, and that is Curse, Dawn of the Abhyss, and his other counterpart, Dark counterpart, which we'll talk about him. But this guy says the following effect. If this card is in your graveyard, you contribute 1 monster, any monster, not have to be just an Abhyss or a reptile, you can contribute any monster, and then special summon this card from your graveyard. Then you get basically to give your opponent back a monster from the graveyard to their side of the field with their effect negated, which is a bad thing, which that's why it's going to only get 3 stars, but you also able, when it's special summon, to get yourself a level 4 or lower Abhyss monster from your graveyard, but banish it won't leave the field. Why is this card good, and why I think it's a lot better than people give it credit for? Now, I am going to say this. This card is definitely terrible the later the game goes, because you're able to give your opponent monsters to special summon it back. So I'm going to say this. It's definitely bad moving forward in every part of the game. So after turn 1 or 2, it's absolutely terrible, but he's able to start your plays really well, and not always your opponent even going to activate a hand trap immediately to even get it back. And Monster Reborning, for example, let's say an Ash Blossom, is good, but reptiles are historically able to remove things really easily, 1, and B, they're not really just that, afraid of an Ash Blossom that much, so it's not the end of the world. And this is the card that I mentioned that kind of worked in tandem with the 2 other cards when I mentioned Nihil, because he and Zoha kind of works really well. So if you have Nihil in your hand and Zoha in your hand as well, like these 2 cards specifically, you're able to use Nihil effect to send himself and Curse to the graveyard, summoning Zoha, use Zoha effect, or so to say, you curse effect to send Zoha to the graveyard, triggering his effect, summoning curse, and then basically trigger the effects that need to be, and then summon Nihil from the graveyard to get the search. So that's why I said that Nihil sending himself to the graveyard with a light reptile is not bad, and this is the card that I meant to, because this card is actually pretty okay. Like I said, it's definitely worse moving forward in every part of the game after turn 1, but it's not absolutely terrible turn 1, so that's actually kind of okay, and I kind of like him quite a bit. Then we're moving on to his pair, which is an absolute terrible card compared to him, which is going to get 1 star, and that is Aleth, Dusk of the Abhyss. This one is absolutely terrible. Same requirement effects of him, just like Curse, but unlike Curse, when he special summoned himself from the graveyard, he gave your opponent to add a card from the graveyard to the hand, which is a lot worse most of the time if you're talking about turn 1. Turn 2 and onward, it's a little bit better because, you know, like, adding cards to your hand, to your opponent's hand is a little bit worse, but it's definitely a lot worse if you're going first, and just differently, his effect doesn't justify that, because his effect says that if you special summon, you get to target 2 of your banished monsters, including at least 1 reptile, and return to the graveyard. Does justify that kind of an effect? I don't think so. This card is bad, and I'm pretty sure at the very most it's going to be played at 1, if any, because this card is very terrible, and I don't recommend to play it at all. Then we're moving on to the second pair, which is the King and the Queen, and these two cards are a little bit complex, but both of them basically require 2 tributes to summon of them of any monsters, again, no restriction on that, and then basically they have additional kind of like floodgates effects. In case of King of the Abhyss, again, like I said, the summoning requirement, but his effect says that if your opponent add a card to their hand except during the draw phase, you get to send 1 random card from their hand to the graveyard. So basically mini Dark Law. Then if a monster your opponent control is sent to the graveyard by a card effect, so from the field basically, you get to add 1 light or dark reptile monster from your deck or graveyard to your hand, so you get a search. This one is a 3 stars. Very, very easy to summon out in decks like Lightsworns, actually, if you're able to get him to the graveyard, because you just need to tribute 2 monsters, get it to your side of the field, and you get your own in Archetype, or to say, in own side Dark Law, I guess, if you want that. I don't think it's good as Christie or something like that, but it's still like an option if you want to. So it is what it is. And it's also able to search if your opponent if a card is sent from your opponent's side of the field to the graveyard, which is really, really cool. So I like this one quite a bit. It doesn't say it's from your side of the field, it just say a card they control to the graveyard. So that's kind of nice. So, you know, I think this card is pretty good. And it's a very, very nice floodgate-like effect, and one of those that you probably want to get to your side of the field, because a Dark Law-like effect is nothing to sneeze about. So this card is pretty nice. Then we have the Queen, which is Amunesia, the Queen of the Abhyss, and she's going to get 2 stars compared to her husband, I guess, or the King, because she's a little bit worse than him. Her effect says that if a monster is special summoned from your opponent's graveyard, you can send 1 card from your opponent controls to the graveyard, and if a monster sent from your opponent's hand or deck to the graveyard, you get to special summon 1 light or dark reptile monster from your graveyard, except herself. So the point is that these 2 cards, basically, as you've probably seen the previous one, kind of like supposed to work in tandem with each other, which is the Queen kind of like benefit from his effect of like sending cards from the hand to the graveyard, and he benefit from Queen's effect to basically sending a card from the field to the graveyard if something was special summoned from the graveyard. But Queen is substantially worse, because Queen basically kind of like only works in really specific requirements, and only with one of particular of the traps, because she says like when a monster your opponent control, one monster from your opponent graveyard is special summoned, so it could work also with a particular trap, but it's definitely a little bit worse compared to the King, because yeah, it's happening a little bit less to have like a monster reborn like effect before your opponent trying to remove this. But it's still really nice, and if your opponent sends something from their hand or deck to the graveyard, which could happen with like a Foolish Burial-like effect, or whatever, you still get to special summon something from the graveyard, so it's not bad. So that's pretty much it for her. And then for the last monster, and the boss monster, Ogdoabyss, the deity of the Abhyss. This one is at 2 stars because First off, yeah, sure, he's a big boss monster, but the problem with him, he requires 3 tributes to summon himself out of the graveyard. Secondly, his effect, which while nice, which is once while face up on the field, you get as a quick effect to send all monsters on the field except monsters that summoned from the graveyard to the graveyard. Basically, he's really, really good, but it's, like I said at the start of the effect, it's once. It's not multiple times. You cannot activate it like multiple times, for our curse of turns. No. It's once. That means that every time you summon him, you only get to use once. And every time that you want to use this effect again and get this floodgate, you have to send him to the graveyard and special summon him back. Which most of the time is going to be requiring 3 tribute for. So this card is pretty, like, not that good, at least right now. Like, it's maybe a one-off, and it does have a nice effect, but, like, it's not amazing because of that. So that's really a shame, but if you're able to trigger Quinn with him, that's actually kind of fine because it's not limited to be summoned by Quinn, so that's okay, I guess. That's pretty much does it for the monsters. Now we'll move on into the spells, and first off we're going to start off with the field spells, or spells and traps I guess, and we're going to start off with the field spell, which is the only spell for the archetype, and that is Depth of the Abhyss, which is the field spell for the archetype. This card have the following 2 effects. If a reptile monster you control is destroyed by battle by an opponent card effect, you get to basically send 1 card your opponent control to the graveyard, basically. And its other effect, if this card is sent to the graveyard destroyed by an opponent card effect, you get to send the card from the top of their deck to the graveyard equal to the number of reptile monsters with different names in your graveyard. This one is definitely 1 star. It doesn't search, its protection effect is really, really easily averted, and if your opponent removes this, it's not really even punishable. So this card is really, really bad, and there's really nothing more to say about this. If you really want to, you can run the 1, but this card is really, 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 really bad. I'm just going to say that. Then for the traps that you most of the time going to search with your, searcher for spells and traps, Emptiness of the Abyss. This one is a little bit more hopeful for the archetype, and I'm going to give this one 3 stars, because this one, during the main phase, so either main phase, you contribute 1 reptile effect monster to target 1 monster in your opponent's graveyard, special summon it to your field. Its effect is not negated, so it's great, but during the end phase you send it to their graveyard back. And then, if this leaves the field by an effect, you get to basically send all monsters you control that are not reptiles to the graveyard. So all non-reptile monsters you have, if this get removed from the field, this is sending them to the graveyard. So it's kind of like, I forgot the Dark Magician Trap effect, which is kind of sucks. But the reason why I'm going to give this one 3 stars is because of the fact that you're able to steal anything you want. Like I said, its effect is not negated. And if you have Queen, it does trigger her, because she says, summon a monster from your opponent's graveyard. It doesn't say where, it just says, summon a monster from your opponent's graveyard. If a monster from your opponent's graveyard is summoned, and this summons from your opponent's graveyard. She didn't say you cannot summon it to yourself in the field, so that's kind of cool. So I guess that still works. And that's pretty much does it for the continuous trap. And for the last card for the archetype, we're going to talk about Invasion of the Abhyss. And this one, summon to you 2 tokens, basically. This is its effect for a trap, which kind of sucks. But if you have 2, or should I say 8 or more Abhyss monsters with different names in your graveyard, you can basically summon 2 reptiles with different names from your graveyard instead. I'm going to give this one 2 stars because 3 reasons. First, this is not always achievable because you don't always open up with Snake Rain. Secondly, it's a trap. And thirdly, why tokens are good. You should have just made this summon 1, and if you do have 8 or more, summon 2. So you could have made it into a monster reborn. If this was a quick play spell, I would say the summoning 2 Abhyss token would have been a little bit more acceptable. And if you are afraid of link summoning, you could have just turned it into, like, as long as they're on the field, you cannot summon anything but reptiles, so you will be incentivized to tribute them if you want to. But yeah, other than that, this card is unfortunately not the best, but it's still okay, maybe as a one-off. I don't know, if you don't open up with Snake Rain, it's pretty much impossible to basically do this kind of an, get 8 to the graveyard and summon 2 of them out of your graveyard. So I'm just going to say that out loud. And even with Snake Rain, it's a little bit hard. So I'm just going to say that out there. But that's pretty much does it for the monsters for the archetype. And what do I think about them overall? Well, the archetype itself is definitely more of like trying to basically do what they did with Emancipators, which is kind of like giving us a strong reptile archetype. But unlike Emancipators, I do not really see any way for this being like really strong, because they went really defensive, like, you know, or should I say like really hard restrictions of the effects, because I think they were really afraid of Snake Rain, which is a shame because they really wanted to see more powerful for these archetype. And one of my biggest problems with the archetype, that it's not a quick effect for the tribute effects of your monsters in the graveyard. If it was something like that, I would say this is actually kind of acceptable and kind of okay. But that's not the case, and that's why I think this is kind of meh in some particular spots. However, it's still a very cool archetype, and it does have hope for itself. I'm going to give it 3 stars because of a few reasons. First off, it has nice reptile support, which basically, if I haven't shown on screen, I would probably show right now, like, you know, the 6 cards that I think can work with it really well. And secondly, it can be played really nicely with a Chaos engine, because it's light and dark, and also Lightsworn engine if you're trying to, or should I say, play it as an engine in Lightsworn if you really want to, because you can mill them to your graveyard, which that's where they want to be, and then trigger their effects. Because most of their effects don't really lock you into reptiles, which is not the end of the world, so that can actually work. Now, of course, don't take my word for it to kind of like exactly play it that way, but that's kind of like my brainstorming ideas, like archetypes that you could try to mix them in, or put those archetype in them, so that could be kind of fun. But that's pretty much does it for the archetype itself. Like I said, I just gave you ideas. I kind of didn't really have an idea for a deck for them right now, and honestly, they're also not released on ADO Pro or Omega, so I cannot really test them yet. But it's definitely two or three ideas that I kind of like thought, you know what, will be really cool. Now, like I said, this archetype is okay, but, you know, with a little bit of support and a little bit good card for a reptile, like one good reptile monster, we might be able to see this around at least as a rogue deck, which could be really fun. But that's pretty much does it for the review. Hope you enjoyed this one. Hope it kind of like explained to you. This archetype is a little bit hard to explain because of its like weird floodgate-like effects, but overall just still very fun. So hope you enjoyed. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you do. Remember, creativity is the key in this game. Have a good day, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.